All right, we are back at it now with the establishment of Castro's authoritarian state following his successful revolution in 1959. So, after Castro took power, he quickly reorganized the government under his control. First, the fundamental law of the republic was drafted, which created essentially a political cabinet, a council of ministers that would be led by Fidel Castro as prime minister of the state, giving him ultimate political control of the country. Freedom of the press in Cuba was restricted. The government took control of the university in Havana. Public show trials were held for supporters of the Batista regime and old military officers of the Batista army, followed by many public executions. The property of elites within Cuba were quickly seized by the government to fulfill the promise of land reform that Castro had made to the peasants of Cuba. Pro-Castro communists took over control of the labor unions within Cuba. And Castro quickly moved towards the creation of a one-party state in Cuba, where various revolutionary organizations, including Castro's own 26 July movement, were organized under what became known as the Integrated Revolutionary Organization. Later, this became the United Party of the Socialist Revolution, led by Fidel Castro. In 1965, this organization became the Cuban Communist Party, the one-party government of Cuba. Opponents of this move towards communism, including some leaders of the 26 July movement, including a guy named Hubert Matos, were arrested and tried for treason against the revolution. Now, Cuban-American relations would face some serious trouble with Castro's move towards a one-party state and nationalization of American-owned businesses. The United States was originally supportive of Castro's rise to power, having pulled their support away from the Batista regime. But his embracing of communists within Cuba threatened that support. And this followed his nationalization of foreign-owned businesses that led the United States to ultimately pull their support away from Fidel Castro. Royal Dutch Shell, American oil companies like Texaco and Standard Oil, Coca-Cola, Sears, all of these massive multinational companies were nationalized in Cuba. This pulled American support from Cuba, which in turn would push Cuba to sign economic agreements with the Soviet Union. This itself would lead the United States to organize the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, this was a part of Dwight Eisenhower's New Look program to contain communism. And here the CIA would organize covert operations to support anti-communist movements throughout the Americas and beyond. In 1960, the CIA used Guatemala. Remember, that was a place where the United States already supported an overthrow of a popularly elected leader. They used Guatemala as a training base for Cuban expatriates and emigres for an attack on Castro's Cuba, hoping that it would spark a popular uprising against Castro's regime. Now, this was executed under President Kennedy in April of 1961, and it was a disaster from the start. The Cuban military was waiting for the arrival. There was no popular support for this movement. The United States only provided limited military support, essentially just a boat ride to the Bay of Pigs. This was a major embarrassment for the United States and President Kennedy, and a propaganda victory for Fidel Castro. This also pushed Castro to unify the state under his control, as he argued that unity was needed to resist future invasions from the United States. Castro also announced that now Cuba was a fully communist nation under that one-party state. Castro himself proclaimed himself to be a Marxist-Leninist, and he would be one until the end of his life. Following the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Soviet Union became Cuba's primary trade partner. Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union, promised to defend Cuba against any future aggression by the United States. Khrushchev proclaimed that the Monroe Doctrine was dead. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine was that 19th century political statement of the United States that the Americas was the United States' backyard and foreign powers needed to stay out. Obviously, Khrushchev was challenging that. The Soviet Union would arm the Cuban military, and they provided millions of dollars in credit to the Cuban government and equipment to the Cuban armed forces. This would include the stationing of long-range nuclear missiles in Cuba. In October 1962, an American CIA U-2 surveillance jet revealed the placement of these missiles in Cuba, which began the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States responded with a naval blockade. We actually called it a quarantine, as a blockade can be an act of war of Cuba, until the missiles were removed, while the United States mobilized its military, preparing for a full-scale invasion of the island. Nikita Khrushchev equated these weapons in Cuba with American missiles that were already stationed in Turkey. This crisis would be resolved with an agreement by Nikita Khrushchev and President Kennedy to remove the missiles from Cuba and for the United States to not invade Cuba. Kennedy also agreed on the down low to remove the missiles from Turkey in January of 1963, following the popular elections in the United States in November of '62. Now, Castro was not supportive of the Soviet Union to withdraw these missiles. He thought it would leave them vulnerable. However, he used the Cuban Missile Crisis as a further propaganda victory, as he could claim he helped save Cuba from future outside invasion from the United States. We'll see you next time.